So yeah, I'll ask some questions to kind of keep you guys engaged, because I know I'm also feeling it, and I'm up here, so you know that's a problem. But if you're here, hopefully you have an interest in accessibility, or know something about accessibility. But if you don't, that's totally fine, because I'm going to tell you all about it, so that's great. I'm Bekah Rice. I am from Columbia, South Carolina. I was originally a designer, turned developer, turned accessibility person, and everything else, probably too many things. I work for a usability consultancy in Columbia called TrueMatter, and we do everything from usability testing to just general consulting on products, all the way to full builds, so from the ground up. We also interface with a lot of development teams to help make sure that the UX stays strong as they're working through sprints and don't get lost in the way. Today we'll specifically be talking about some of the things that I've seen over the years working in accessibility and as a developer that are problematic and how you can solve them, as well as just an overview of kind of the state of things with accessibility. So this is kind of the most recent number I can find, but 42.5 million in the US alone people have some form of disability. This can be something that we can see, maybe a mobility issue, low vision or blindness, or it can be something like a cognitive disability like ADHD or autism or what have you. That is just the US. This is the world. So 1.3 billion, that's quite a lot of people. And this doesn't include people with situational disabilities. So how many of you have broken your wrist or finger before? Again, crowd participation. Okay, stay awake. So when that happened, was it easy to use your mouse or keyboard? What did you do instead? How did you work around and do your job during that time? I'm sure it wasn't fun. I've never been in that predicament, thankfully. But this number does not include that. So at any given time, we could find ourselves in a state where we cannot do our jobs or cannot use digital products in the way that we are used to. So this impacts quite a bit of people. Why does it matter? Well, you're excluding those people. That's 16% of the population, so you're kind of being a huge jerk. If that doesn't matter to you, if you are somehow one of these lawful evil people, you'll at least care about the legal ramifications and being on the wrong side of the law. How many of you work for a company who's been sued for ADA inaccessibility? I'm just kidding, don't raise your hand. The fact that some of you thought about it just goes to show how big of an issue this actually is. So many countries across the world and even the United States have adopted W3C's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We're on version 2.2 as basically our laws. So it's a voluntary standard by default, but for the US specifically, the ADA passed in 1990. Section 508, which you guys have probably heard thrown around, adopted the WCAG. I'll just be saying that the rest of the talk because it's long. Adopted that in 2017. So Section 508 actually just applies to government organizations and nonprofits. So for a while, this was still something we all talked about and should have cared about, but it was a little under the radar until 2019. Some might argue earlier. In 2019, the Ninth Circuit Court held up an ADA lawsuit against Domino's, of all people, saying that those ADA laws apply to services of a place of public accommodation, not just services in a place. So that means you don't have to worry just about having an accessible building, having wheelchair ramps and accessible bathrooms. You have to worry about it for your website as well. So this set a huge legal precedent that now means any one of us working for any company could see a lawsuit at some point regarding accessibility of our digital products. Today, that's 4,600 cases in 2023 alone. That's quite a bit just around digital accessibility. So the other thing you might care about, again, if you're still not convinced, is just losing business. So 16% of the population has a disability. That's, again, not including situational or temporary disabilities. So that's quite a bit of money that you're potentially losing. I hadn't really thought about this until we did a kind of a meetup group in Columbia where we invited folks of different abilities to come speak about their frustrations and use of digital products. And one of them specifically, who was blind, just said that they don't get my money. If their product isn't accessible, I don't buy it, I don't use it. So that right there, to me, was kind of an eye-opening thing. And I also realized, she's just using her phone. So she didn't have a laptop. She could do everything she needed for her job and everything else just with an iPhone. So it's something that I don't think we factor in day to day, that there's just a lot of the population, again, including those situational disabilities, that might not be able to use this beautiful, wonderful thing we built because we didn't account for their specific disability. So we talked about the WCAG guidelines, and I think for a lot of people, they kind of seem like a bit of a bear. They're kind of hard to understand. The way they're written isn't super user-friendly, which is hilarious because accessibility and usability are very much hand in hand. But just to kind of summarize what each of these mean, the 4 basic principles that make up WCAG is just perceivability. So can the person actually see what they're doing? So that means different things for different people's ability. If I'm blind, can I use a screen reader to hear what's on the screen? If I'm deaf, can I read subtitles to watch the video that might be on the screen? If I'm colorblind, can I still perform the task without relying on colors to indicate that something's important? All of these factor into whether something is perceivable, and they all involve using multiple senses at any given time to execute on a task. Is it operable? So this one should seem pretty straightforward. Can I use it? Can I use it with a keyboard if I don't have a mouse? Can I do it in a certain amount of time? So I know we have all encountered the dreadful, you're in the ticket line, you've already purchased, but if you don't check out in the next 30 seconds, we're gonna kick you back out. How frustrating was that? Raise of hands, we're awake. All right. So that's another thing to factor in, but it also can mean for someone that's elderly or has Parkinson's or just poor motor skills, if we have those big mega drops on our site that use hover to activate, will they have enough time to enter into that mega drop and get to where they need without it closing? These are things that all involve the operability of the products that we're designing. Another one is just understandability. We hope, that's a big one, that whatever we build can be used appropriately and as expected. But this can also mean the instructions around using that product. If we have something that relies on just one of those senses, it kind of fails both being understandable if I don't have one of those senses, but also being perceivable. So are the instructions on the site in a way that I can access? So if I don't have a mouse, a tooltip can be one of those things that sometimes only works on hover. That can be extremely frustrating. And lastly, is it robust? So can I use your product with all forms of assistive technology currently? But this also means, will your product evolve over time as new assistive technologies are developed? So this is an ongoing part of those guidelines. So that was a little overview. But one of the big things that you'll see in the examples I show later is that with any one of the WCAG guidelines, there are numerous ways to meet them. It's not a one-to-one, I have to do it this way. And I feel like a lot of developers can feel kind of forced into a box with these guidelines that they have to do everything a certain way, and that is not the case. Before we get into that, just real quickly, testing your product for accessibility. There are whole companies that do this, and that's great. I think it is very important to rely on an expert for things like this, but you can also do some of it yourself, and a lot easier than you think. Simple things like using your keyboard. So making sure that you can activate and engage with every piece of your UI using just your keyboard. That's crucial. You could try going outside, like if it's a really bright day, you have your contrast turned all the way up on your phone, you still have a hard time seeing things, maybe the contrast of your UI isn't strong enough. If you were to read only the headings and the actions on the page, would you be able to understand what you're looking at, what it's about? People that use assistive technology, specifically a screen reader, often navigate just by headings and links because it's a lot faster. Whereas we can skim something very quickly with our eyes, they're doing the same thing with a screen reader. And not having good headings, good actions on the page can really limit that. What happens if you hide all the images? You can easily do this in Chrome Developer Tools. If you do that, do you lose anything important? Is there any context that that image is giving that's now gone? If it is, you need alt text. If not, no image. If you turn your sound off, that's another big one. I think we're all guilty of doing this, being somewhere or watching a video on our phone, probably not supposed to. We're using the subtitles. So again, this is not just applying to those with disabilities, but for our own convenience. And then lastly, what happens if you zoom in 400%? This is something that people with low vision actually do a lot. We always assume they're using a screen reader and they're having it read out loud, but oftentimes they're just zooming in, like scrolling horizontally, which to me seems like a nightmare, but if it gets the job done, that's what they're doing. So those are some very simple ways that you could test. And now let's look at some issues, the fun part. So these are some of the common problems I've seen, and one of the things that's kind of tricky about doing a conference like this, where we have so many frameworks represented and we're all doing things in different things, I wanted to show examples of how the browser would render it. So you'll see HTML examples, because that's the one thing we all can see and understand. But for any one of these, if you're using Angular or React, they're obviously going to be marked up in different ways. The first big thing I see is just poor structure. In the early days of HTML, I think this was a lot easier to conquer because you had such a limited set of things that you could use, and our code was very semantic back then. It was just a lot easier to make sure that we had something that these assistive technologies could read. Today, We have so much to work with, and with that comes more issues. So just having semantic code that is readable by the browser, I know it's hard to believe, is a big problem. In the majority of the sites that I test, they're just elements used incorrectly. And a lot of that can be that these are new folks, or it's just people that are working in a framework and they're not as familiar with HTML or the importance of that semantic structure. So this means if I'm using, HTML5, it's using those elements, those landmarks like the header and the footer, not using strictly visual cues and just keeping things very simple. Some examples of that are making sure that the DOM order matches the visual order. This is one that we don't think about a lot. If I'm looking at the page visually, the order that it's on the page is how I'm going to see it, right? If I'm using a screen reader and I'm not skipping around and just reading the page, the DOM order is going to impact when I hear the thing that I'm looking at. So this can be something if we have, say a modal that pops up, the order that it pops up in the DOM, that can cause a lot of confusion if you're actually listening to the page. Similarly, the way things are sectioned, again, I mentioned people that use screen readers often will skip from landmark to landmark, so from like the header to the main body content, just to save time, similar to how we skim when we're reading. And so using, sectioning elements can be really great for that. Highly recommend. Using table markups, using lists, correct semantic elements for lists. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but the number of times I've seen people just throw a bunch of spans around elements and then place them so they look like a list is really common. And then lastly, using table markups for tables. There was a period, some of you might remember, where we used tables for everything because we could position things the way we wanted, and it was awesome. It was a complete nightmare for those using screen readers. It still is, because a lot of times we'll use tables to display information in a certain way, but exclude things like column headers and header rows, which are really, really important for assistive technology. Another thing that we should never do, that I'm sure we've heard, if not, I will cry. Just kidding. But describing clickable elements as links, buttons, and form controls. And this is a hard one to write because it encompasses a lot. But this is basically like, don't make a div a button. And if you haven't had someone yell at you about that, here I am. I know it's very common, especially when we're first learning to code. We do all kinds of things. We're experimenting, like what's easiest here and there. But these all were created for a very specific purpose. So we need to use elements for what they were meant for. And anytime we try to substitute, we lose a lot of the accessibility that's baked in there. All of that accessibility can be seen. So if you're not familiar with Chrome Developer Tools, I'm sure we are, this is the DOM structure, but there's also an accessibility tree that's baked in over here on the right. And so anytime that we use a non-semantic element, like I have a span here that says flat button, that accessibility tree sees nothing that it should convey to assistive technology. So here it literally says like, element not interesting for accessibility. I mean, I don't know how else you could say that. So if we're doing anything that we're not sure about, this is actually a great tool, but it also shows you, again, that order and how that can be important for anyone using assistive technology to understand what's there. So some examples of the things that I've talked about here that we could use is those HTML5 sectioning elements. Again, this is how it would be rendered in the browser, so there are a number of ways to do this with different frameworks. But what I would expect to see is something like this. So in this example, I might have multiple headers, so I'm actually labeling this one so that they know this is the main header, this is the side nav. Adding in little things like that can make the experience better, but it also can be better for developers. So if I have multiple header elements there, and I'm searching by a nav element through someone else's code, having these descriptors can be very helpful, I find. Another way that we could do this is if I have side nav, I could use the aside element. And for my main content area, I'd use the main element. That would be expected. And there are many ways you can do this without actually using HTML5 elements. You could use ARIA labels all over it. That's very common. With any given issue or problem we face, there are many ways to do it. Last one is the footer. I think we've all kind of seen that. These are, I think, the most basic examples of should do. One that is important both as developers, but also, do we have any designers, writers in the room? Or asleep again, or we just don't have any, that's fine. Is our content hierarchy. So we've talked about, semantic code, that involves a lot of structure, but also just making sure that we're using headers in a thoughtful way. Not something that's very common to actually use our headers in order, so they're numbered for a reason. And to keep related items with each other. So an example of that is using the nested header elements, which I showed. So if you've got a main header, that should be at the top. Anything that is kind of sub-navigation should be below that. Writing very clear and simple headings. If someone is navigating through like a long page of content, with a screen reader especially, they're going to rely on those headings to find the information they're looking for. But even me, myself, without low vision, I'm looking at those headings too. If I am doing something online and you're requiring me to read more than 2 sentences, I'm probably going to be pretty pissed off. So I'm going to be going through those headings, finding the thing that's relevant to what I'm looking for, and be done and move on. This can also be semantically communicated, as we just talked about. So here's an example of what that might look like. So this is the visual representation of the page with some examples of how I use semantic elements to structure it. An even better example that's less code-based is taking something like this, where I have very important information about the times for the bus, how I find out about them, buried in this long wall of text. If I had used headings appropriately, it could become this, or even just the way I grouped things that were related with one another. So this goes into design and the user experience of what we're doing, more so than even just the code. This also illustrates the next thing, which is proximity and grouping. So if things are related, put them near each other. This can mean using a field set for groups of fields. In a little bit, I'll show a screen reader demo where they did not do this, and it's very confusing. This could also be placing the label before the field. If I'm using a screen reader or just my eyes, and I'm going down a long form, the first thing I'm going to see for each field is the label that's telling me what I need to do. If it's in front of the field, that makes it a little easier. And then just keeping related items with the same sectioning, that are related within the same sectioning element. So I showed that graphic with kind of the nav and the header and the main. So anytime we have related elements, putting them near one another, always a good way to go. Now to the meat. The thing that we do probably the most is our functional elements, controls, forms, really what makes our products able to do most of the things that they do. The biggest thing here is making them keyboard accessible. There are so many times where if we're doing one of our simple testing techniques of just using the keyboard to go through the page, you'll get to something where you can't actually access it with a keyboard. So that can be hugely frustrating for those that need assistive technology, but also for those folks that broke the wrist or the hand and can't use their mouse. So that gets an exclamation mark because it's that important. One way that you can make sure that that happens is by using standard controls. So instead of using a div and a span to be a form field or text field, use a text field. So this comes back kind of full circle to that using semantic code. This can also be watching out for keyboard traps, which I'll show an example in a minute. This is when I'm using a keyboard, I get inside a modal or a window and I can't get out. That can be hugely frustrating and usually requires the user to reload the window. So if you can see, I'm about to start playing this. This one doesn't have sound. But if you watch down here at the bottom, you can see I'm tabbing around and I'm actually encountering things, but I can't see it happening on the screen. And I'm not encountering any of the things that are in that modal. So this is actually a reverse keyboard trap, which happens when I activate a modal window, and instead of having focus inside it, I get stuck outside of it. If I couldn't see my screen in that situation, that would be maddening. So never relying on visual cues. There we actually had to even see anything was happening on the screen, so they also didn't have focus states. Visual cues can include icons. So anytime we have little icons, maybe to show you have a new alert message or this is really important, if we don't also have the accompany like ARIA labels or alt text for that, it means nothing. Changing colors, so this can happen a lot in form validation. If we make a field red, to us it conveys there might be an error. To someone that can't see colors or is completely blind, it means nothing. And then these required field asterisks, which I'll show some different examples. Typically, nowadays we just assume people know what they mean and we don't even include the asterisk means required at the top of forms. That can be hugely problematic for anyone that hasn't encountered that. So this is an example using a screen reader of pretty old site. I don't think this is actually like this anymore, but I'll kind of describe what you're hearing as I go through. So whenever you're hearing the screen reader, there are kind of two modes that you can operate in. One is just reading mode, where it just reads straight down the page. Another is what I described earlier, where you navigate via headings or links, and that's using kind of depending which screen reader, like a rotary mode where you can select through. And then here I'm going to enter into forms mode, which is how I would typically fill out a form. It really just reads the actual form element and its label, and then any buttons or actions that are associated with that.
//register.rocktheboat.com.
So it just got here.
Online voter registration. Clickable combo box collapse. Select language. List. Email address.
Now I'm in forms mode. You kind of hear that little sound when you enter a field.
Next step button link. Online voter registration.
So what are you not hearing here?
Register to vote. Voter registration time takes an average of 2 minutes.
No errors. I'm not hearing that anything is wrong in this situation. And so because I can't see the screen, I actually turn it off to do these. I just kept clicking the button.
Edit. Graphic help. Required item.
They at least did that.
List with 2 items heading level 3 zip code start. Edit.
So I ended up going back up and entering read mode so that I could actually hear the required text because it wasn't within the form and it wasn't marked up in a way where it would actually read it to me. And so eventually I figured it out. But that's one example of just many like this. And during that panel I mentioned earlier where we had folks with different abilities kind of talk about their struggles and frustrations, one of the ones that really hit me was this guy who's completely blind. He went to pay his credit card bill, which he had done before on his phone. For some reason, he was on a laptop. And he got to the end of the form, hit submit, didn't hear anything. It was like, that's weird. Didn't tell me I did it. Didn't tell me I didn't do it. So he hit the button again. Should never do that. He ended up paying his credit card bill 5 times and then having to get on the phone, having to talk to them and explain the situation. And of course, they're not going to be mad if you pay more money than they wanted you to. And that was could have been solved by correct markup. So here are some ways you can mark up a required field. There are going to be many. One is simply add the required attribute. This is the easiest, but it can be tricky given some browsers will automatically add the little tooltip if it's required with an error message, so sometimes that can be a pain. You can use ARIA attributes. These are great. If for some reason, again, because you're using a framework that doesn't let you add the required attribute, can't imagine what that would be, you have this option, ARIA required. You can also, if you need to, put required by the label. This would probably be my least favorite approach. I'm usually of the mind that if all fields are required, then only mark the optional ones, because you shouldn't have a bunch of fields or a bunch of form elements in the form if they're not required, in my opinion, because then you're making me do more work. And then even worse example, but still totally an option if you feel limited by these other options, is to just state that the asterisk means that it's a required field. Lastly, if it's in a field set, you would make sure that the legend is actually stating that this is a required field. Because if you heard in that example, I never heard that the fields were required at all because I was in forms mode. This is one way to make sure that your instructions, or in this case, any kind of commands about the fields are read by the screen reader. So another thing that didn't get read at all, just pointing out, was that tooltip, because I couldn't interact with it with my keyboard, so we never heard it. And that seems like pretty important information that I would have wanted to know. All right, so you kind of heard some of this in that example, but another big one gets an exclamation mark for this reason is labeling all of your controls. As a designer, I know that the design sometimes dictates that I don't have a big bold label above my text field. Totally get it. There are lots of options, though, that would allow me to still have an accessible instance of that. So I'm going to play this one.
Heading level 1 visited link shoot. Form landmark find the best for your.
You can kind of see where my cursor is.
Combo box collapse editable. Button. Find the best for your.
I went back through.
Combo box collapse editable. Button. Navigation landmark list with 3 items 24.
So now I'm in the nav. So here I went through, started, you heard Chewy, it was the H1, which was cool. I get into the field, I hear nothing. I get to the little search icon, which is the button to activate the search, and I just hear button. So in this case, it was actually 2 things that weren't labeled. Here visually, we're relying on the placeholder text to tell me what this is. You know, if I have eyes, this is very obvious, but if I'm using a screen reader, not very obvious. One of the things I always try to avoid is using placeholder text like this, because the minute I type into the field, it disappears, and if there was anything important for that to say, it's gone and not helping me anymore. But for accessibility, it's not read at all, unless I go back into that read mode in this case. So here are some better ways you could have done that. Best way, just add a label. There are many ways to position this off screen if you need to. Tons of articles on that I have at the end I will share. But if I can, ideally I should show it, because not everyone is using a screen reader, and some folks might not realize what the field is for just by looking at it. The Chewy example was pretty good, but that's not always the case. A good way is which I'll actually go back to show this better. I'm using the for attribute here and also an ID on my input. So this automatically associates the two in a very strict way that can't be confused. Another way you can do that is by actually wrapping the label around the input. So if for some reason, again, I'm just imagining worst case scenarios, you can't use the for attribute. Oh no, you can wrap the input in a label. So that's another option. You can also use a title, which I don't have here. An okay way is you can have it look like a label and then use ARIA label on the input. Again, all of these are fine. They're just kind of different ways you could approach this. Some more complex than others, which to me is the good versus bad. And so when you can't use a label like the Chewy example, because they have a very streamlined kind of top section there, what I probably would have done, like I mentioned earlier, was hide that label off screen. There are many ways to do that where, other than display none, you don't do that because that literally hides it from everyone, including assistive devices. But I can hide it off screen in such a way that it's not visual, but it is read, and it's read in the correct order. So this is how I probably would have done that. I also added it to the button, which is a span, but this would have still worked because it actually was a span. So grouping controls is one I've already showed some examples for, but this is another one that gets really annoying when testing because as you'll hear in a minute, you will hear all of the other elements involved in this control except for the one that you really need.
Invalid entry has U.S military affiliation grouping. No radio button check 1 of 2. No radio button not check 1 of 3. U.S military affiliation grouping. Yes radio button check 2 of 2. No radio button check 1 of 2.
So here I went back and forth because you kind of missed the first one. But it actually didn't read, do you have transfer credits? So I heard this question, U.S. military affiliation, and I get no, yes, I'm not sure. So because this was not marked up in a field set where do you have transfer credits would have been the legend and the others would have been wrapped within that field set, I really get like 2 no's and 2 yeses, which is immensely confusing if I can't see the screen. So the way I would have done this is just use a field set with, again, any of that important instructional information in the legend at the top. This makes sure that no matter if they're in read mode or in forms mode, they're going to hear it. And then validation, our favorite part of designing forms. Who loves dealing with form validation? Are you still awake? Bored you to death? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Come on, someone. I'm just kidding. No one does. So much so that at True Matter, we have tested hundreds of thousands of forms. This is probably the primary thing that we do because people hate filling out forms online. They hate doing it on a screen. They hate doing it on paper, so it makes sense that they hate doing it on a screen as well. But there are a lot of ways that we can make it a better experience, and we have tested it so much that we have come up with what I consider the ideal pattern for form validation from a visual side of things. And that is this, to have a big red box at the top because people sometimes don't see the error messages. This one I'm not going to miss. And to show the error message above the field label here. So this is also based on some eye tracking studies that we've looked at, and this is tested the best. But it also just works for a lot of different situations and can be done in such a way where the label is beside the field and you can still use this pattern. So one of the things you want to make sure is that all of this is semantically marked up correctly, that we have required fields marked up as such, and that we have special ARIA labeling that associates our big error message at the top with the form itself. Another thing that I always make sure to do is to put focus in the, put focus in the field that has the error. So that is a convenience thing, especially if I'm on mobile and it's a long form, which I hope it isn't. If that is the case, putting focus there immediately allows them to hear the error message, correct the issue, and move on with their lives. So if I was going to mark up that example, again, we're having the label first. And for my error message, I've added an ID to it that relates back to the ARIA described by attribute here. So that's one way you could do that. There are a couple others, but I think this is the most straightforward, and in my testing with different screen readers, this has been the most successful. All right, so almost there. Buttons and links. We kind of already talked about not using things that aren't buttons and links for buttons and links. So again, back to using semantic elements. But labeling them is a big problem. So we heard already with the Chewy example, it just said button. You're about to hear in a minute a whole lot of button. And I've gone through whole pages where I heard the same for images, for buttons, for links, and it is, again, maddening to use. So this is a very old version of the Twitch site, I believe.
Link visited link.
And I'm at the header.
Out of link visited link. Out of link visited link discovered. Link
Okay, I think I went back.
Link try front. Button more NAV items. Search. Edit search. Clickable button.
Good so far, if you can see where I am.
Button login. Button sign up. Button. Graphic Excel Center. Join the Twitch community.
So here the actual login button, or the button to get to my profile if I'm already logged in, just said button. So they did everything right. They went to all the trouble, except for someone probably got to that icon at the end and felt like, yeah, we're good. This can be a problem if you have multiple developers working on the same team. Don't know if that was the case here, but I always find it odd when everything's working and I get to one button that isn't labeled. And it could just be a slip up. I know I've certainly done that. If you're in a hurry, you can miss things like that. So giving links and buttons the text that explains what they do is really crucial. This also goes into more than just how we mark it up, but also the actual wording that we use. So I'll show you an example in a minute where things like learn more, hopefully you've heard this, learn more, click here, don't really convey what the button's going to do for someone, especially using a screen reader, but also for someone that's just seeing it on the page. We always want to make sure that we're labeling our buttons and links as succinctly as we can, but also in a way that it helps the user understand what they can expect. Images that are linked, so that was actually just an image of the little person icon, have to have alt text. If they don't, then it just reads the image URL. You can also use a title attribute, that's fine too. I don't have a lot of examples of that because I feel like most people have heard of the importance of alt text, I hope. But if an image is not important, one, it shouldn't be a link, but also it shouldn't have alt text. So I don't have to listen to a ton of information about images that don't give me context, or further context about what I'm looking at. So this is just 3 different examples of how I could mark up a button that's an icon. So I could use ARIA label for that. I could use, what else do I have? The role on it. I don't know why I did that one. And then lastly, I can actually just do that SR only. So that's a class that I typically use where it's positioned off screen, but it's still available for assistive technology. Focus states is another big one that you've seen in all of the examples I've shown, actually the videos. Very rarely did you see a focus state. And in WCAG 2.2, this has actually become more of a thing where they've given pretty clear guidelines on what they expect the focus state to look like for AAA, which is kind of like the third stage of ultimate accessibility, which I know for our clients, they're kind of focused on AA, which is the standard for 508. But this is really important, again, if I'm using my keyboard. And so here, kind of an older version of the ESPN site. I made sure you could hear my keyboard and not the screen reader because I am tabbing through the whole site. If you can guess where I am without looking down here, you win a prize. So I finally got to the search bar and it did something and that told me where I was. But this can be a huge pain, not just for those using assistive technology, but for me if I broke my wrist hand using a keyboard, which for a lot of people that do heavy data entry, that's just their go-to, especially if they're filling out a form. They're not going to be scrolling up and down. They're going to be tabbing from field to field. And if they can't do that, it's hugely frustrating. So the biggest way you can prevent this frustration is to just allow browsers to do what they do automatically. You don't actually have to create a focus state. You don't even have to style it. It will just apply it. But for some reason, sometimes people don't like the way they look. They'll disable it and not factor in the fact that they now have to create a focus state for every clickable element. Also, making your own. I prefer this method, and in WCAG 2.2, the AAA considerations they've added, they have pretty clear guidelines about what they think is best and most visible. But this could be something like an example I'll show in a minute where they had an all blue site. Most browsers have kind of that blue fuzzy outline by default, and if your brand color is blue, it's really hard to see the focus state. So something to consider, and if you are a designer, it's kind of a fun challenge to think up how can I have both a hover, an active, and a focus state that are all unique and all convey some kind of important information to the user. So this is an example of a blue site that used orange, which I think works pretty well in this case. It gets a little weird down lower because it's not quite enough contrast, but just one example of how they solved that. So last example I'm going to show before we kind of talk about resources. I appreciate y'all hanging in there. You don't look too sleepy yet. is when you get into really accessible code, but poor design or poor UX. And I actually see this more often than I see bad code now, which one makes me very happy because it's like all these developers, they've learned how to make their code accessible, they're doing a really great job. But then we're still kind of lacking in judgment around the design and the UX. And so it really pains me that this is my example because it's like a user experience like class site, Interaction Design Foundation. And they offer offer classes on usability. And the reason this is a problem, and I didn't add the like animated image of it because it wasn't working, is all of the numbers on the screen. So you see days, hours, and then at the top, all of those move. All of them count down. And if you're someone like me, like I can't handle anything moving in my periphery, it's very hard to focus on the content because you have all this motion on the screen. The other thing is all of these buttons, they are coded in an accessible way. They have an ARIA label that like points back to the name of the class. But for me, as someone that can see, they say view course, but I have to actually see the course name kind of up here on top of this image. And it's a little hard to scan this and quickly see what course I'm looking for because I'm also dealing with all of this motion and movement. So there are a lot of examples here where this is completely fine. If I was using a screen reader, I'd actually have a better experience, I think, in my opinion, than just using it, looking at it here. And that can happen too. So I don't say that to scare people because it's like, well, I did everything right, but it's still not great for accessibility or usability. But just to point out that that can happen to any one of us. I mean, it certainly happened to me. And just something else to kind of factor in when you're thinking about these. So that was a lot. Are we still okay? Yeah. So takeaways. Don't be a jerk. Make your products accessible. I hope this is the biggest takeaway, really, of all of it, is that this is the best thing you can do, not just for those of us that are disabled, but for everyone. Making accessible products make products better for everyone. They make them more usable. Those things go hand in hand. You won't get sued if you do this. So again, if you don't care about being a jerk, I hope you care about losing money. And you won't make your customers angry because this makes it better for everyone that's using it. So everyone's favorite part, tools and resources. I'll leave this up for a minute. But these are some of the ones that I use for manual testing, as well as some free ones that you can use for just like ad hoc testing. I will say be very careful of like scanners and automated testing because they miss a lot of things. I've seen clients get a letter threatening a lawsuit. This is very common. And they include like an Excel spreadsheet with all the violations that their scan found. And it looks very scary because you're looking at it and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like 500 things. Well, then I go test and I find those things plus maybe 500 more. Actually, always like 500 or more. And so they're not even accounting for really some of the bigger issues that you can only find through doing things like using your keyboard. A lot of these automated scans aren't factoring that in and really can't because, again, automated. So it's always important to do manual testing, but these tools can be really handy for finding things, especially if it's a bigger site. And for color contrast, that's something, if you're a designer, that should be a consideration. And that can be tricky because things can look to you like they have good contrast, but depending on if someone, the type of color blindness someone has, or again, the setting, if they're outside on a bright day, it could be bad. And so it's good to use the formula that these tools use to make sure that it truly does have enough contrast. We have lots of articles that cover way more than I just talked about and really are more topic-based. So if there's a specific thing that I have talked about that you want to go in more depth on, this is a great place to start. And now I have time for questions. You guys look so excited to ask questions. Go ahead. Sorry. Yes, I can post them somewhere. I don't know if we have a designated place for the conference, but I can post them on our website and share them on, I used to say I will share them on Twitter, but I don't do that. I refuse to get blue sky. But I will find out if the conference is going to send out anything so I can make it more direct. But I can actually put it on this page if that's helpful. They are also fully accessible, just bragging. Go ahead.
Earlier when you were talking about label all controls, when you were talking, say, giving the examples of how to do it, you said the best way to do it is to put a label, use the HTML4 property, and then attach that to the input. And you said an okay way was to use the
Mm-hmm.
Why, if you are going to end up hiding the label for the screen reader anyway, why is that worse? My understanding was that those are functional.
They are functionally the same. And so this comes back to kind of an old school way of thinking. A lot of older instances of like JAWS and NVDA, so screen readers, didn't always support all of the different ARIA attributes. And we don't know with new assistive technologies what they will and won't support, but typically, like 99.9% of the time, semantic normal HTML is supported. So if we want to make sure, like, no matter what, nuclear apocalypse, like, I don't know, ARIA labels just don't work for anything, we know that that will work because that's how the element was designed when they designed HTML. So, yeah. I try to not use the word like best, better, whatever, but I do think it's important to show that there are lots of options, and, you know, if you want to be as thorough as possible, some are a little better than others.
So what you're saying is I don't need to go back.
No. You don't have to, no. Yeah.
So I know in your last slide you were talking about how you might be doing code accessibility, but then design
Mm-hmm.
something like that. What would you recommend to, I guess, like before the product's out, like in your experience, how have you worked with the designer in order to make
Yeah. So I've actually worked on a lot of projects where I'm not the designer and like someone within the company we're interfacing with is. And one of the big things I like to do is just have a conversation up front before they've even started, ideally. That doesn't always happen, where I can talk about some of the common problems that I'm aware of, like color contrast, just thinking about how to make sure that headings, clickable elements are really obvious. Because I know, like myself as a designer, I want to do the fun stuff. I want to innovate, you know, like make it really aesthetically pleasing. But the functional side of my brain, like the accessible person side, understands that that's not best for everyone, and depending on what the product is. So that would be my typical approach. If I can't do that, a lot of what we do is kind of accessibility consulting. And so we'll be presented with a design and be able to go through it and point out any issues that are there and instances where they could, you know, try something different. With that, though, it's always a compromise. You know, they could have maybe poor contrast, but be using a tool that allows the user to change, like to dark mode. That's one thing that over the last, you know, couple years is hugely popular for myself also. That really helps, because if you do have low contrast, being able to default to what the browser wants for light and dark can help there.
Is there anywhere, I know there's an accessibility like tool in DevTools where you do check that and run your screen reader too. Is there like somewhere that can give you a score or, you know, to see your passing of that process?
Unfortunately, no. And actually, that's something that I think is kind of confusing for folks. There's not like a check. Like there's not like you can add a little graphic to your site in the footer that says you're accessible, but currently there isn't really a like agreed upon standard other than WCAG where you can just kind of say I'm accessible. And one of the big reasons I think that doesn't exist is because digital products are changing constantly. That's kind of the point. We're always iterating, we're always improving, or we have content that's contributed or that comes from users. So any kind of like social media site has that problem, or we've handed it off to the client. Now they're managing their content on their site. That's hugely problematic unless we've trained them on best practices for accessibility. So there isn't like a seal of approval. As far as scoring, if you use any of those automated tools, they certainly will give you all kinds of metrics and like cool looking stuff that tells you like how good or bad it is. Even like Google out of the box with Lighthouse has an accessibility score. And that can be a great starting place. It can especially give you some indication of like how bad things are. So then you know how much you need to worry, I guess. But again, it misses a lot. And so that is one of the things that's kind of like sad, I think, about the state of accessibility right now, but also a problem I don't know how we would easily solve because of just the nature of what we do and how it's changing. I hope that answered that. Last minute things? Then we can all take a nap. I'm just kidding. We got another talk at 4.
So off that same vein, do you have anything that you use to continuously validate, like just some kind of, if not a metric, but like
Yeah.
a baseline of?
We do for any clients that we have long term that we're regularly helping them maintain their products. We do once a year audit, or if not more. So for a lot of our banking clients, financial institutes got hit very hard in 2020 and 2021 with lawsuits. They were kind of one of the first like public entities to start seeing all of these like lawsuit letters. Now it's just about everyone, every industry is facing this. And so we'll do an audit where I usually start out by running an automated scan. And I do that because, again, these are clients managing their own content. And the first thing I don't want to do is look for all their missing alt text. which is like 90% of the mistakes they make, which is easier, but still a problem. And so those kind of things you can do with a scan because it's just skimming through the code. It's looking, oh, there's an image, here's its alt text. And so I like to do ones, I use something called Screaming Frog. I didn't have that on there because I think it's technically an SEO tool and it's paid. And it'll give me a spreadsheet of every image, what page it's on, what the alt text is. Because it's one thing to find images that don't have an alt attribute or have alt text. It's another to be able to see what it actually is, because it can totally pass a scan and be like placeholder. And so it's helpful just to do those kinds of tedious things. But on top of that, we do full manual testing for their site each year. And I know that sounds really annoying because that's a lot of work, but for clients that don't have an internal resource, that's really the only option. But I always encourage, if you have an interest in it, a great way to like continue in your organization and be completely invaluable is to be their accessibility person. I'm not speaking from experience or anything on that. Screaming Frog. It's probably not even the best. It was just the one I found at the time. But it'll give you a lot of interesting metrics about, it's a crawler, so, Yeah.
Our website has a bunch of different theme colors.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to I wanted to go through and figure out which theme colors worked on top of other theme colors to meet contrast minimums. I ended up just making a big spreadsheet for it to figure out. Is there a tool where I can just put in a whole bunch of values and it spits out that?
If you found that or you could find that, please let me know, because there's not that I have found, sadly. It is hugely painful to do what you just described. I have been there, especially if you've got interactive elements, so then you have to account for hover and focus, and that's even more colors and states. What I used, spreadsheet, great idea, because you can at least keep track of it. I didn't include this one either, but I use, it's actually an app, it's only for Mac, called Contrast. And it's a little one of those toolbar like widgets, and at any point I can get a color picker for anything on the screen and compare it, and it gives me a number. I like that because it's fast. And I literally can just 2 colors, it tells me, and then you can put it in a spreadsheet. But other than that, I don't know of one. Yeah. If someone finds something like that, please share with the group, because I have not. But also, I'm really bad about just sticking with things that work, because once you kind of get it down and you like have a process, it's, Cool. If you have other questions, you can find me. Thank you.